In 1970, David Gaff worked on a signal gang in the Canadian Rockies and took his cinefilm camera to help tell his fascinating story. Scenes vary from trackside, riding on work trolleys, watching track relaying, and riding on the Super Continental train back to Vancouver with the locomotive engineer and in the dome car. Now David sets the scene.
I've been living in Vancouver with Tony Hughes for about 4 or 5 months. And we decided that we wanted to go down into the United States. But of course we couldn't work there. So if we wanted to make that trip, we would have to save up enough money to do so. We heard that there was work available in Alberta in the oil fields. But when we got there, we were immediately put right that no such thing existed anymore.
There were no jobs in the oil fields, and there certainly wasn't any grand amounts of money to be made in a quick amount of time. But a name we have come across before, and which appears on the bottom of this building, became our salvation. An evening spent in the Ayford Arms, which overlooked the CN offices, gave us the idea.
Why not look for a job on the railways? We had our interview straight away, took our isometric test. How many questions with an IQ rating could you answer in a certain period of time? And of course, we'd been taking tests all over Canada. We'd practiced. We could do it very quickly, and they thought we were amazing. So we got a job on a signal gang operating on a section of track near Mount Robson, in fact, at a place called Little Fort.
Little Fort was located on the Clearwater subdivision on the main line between Blue River and Kamloops Junction. David's 1970 employee timetable shows the CN main line between Jasper and Vancouver, with the Clearwater subdivision in the heart of British Columbia's Rocky Mountains.
This train with bunk cars, a cook car, and 24 guys was to be our home for the next few months. Riding up and down the railway line in motorised vehicles, this is Pete by the way, was to be our mode of transport. For a bet one day, and just to prove he could, Pete ate 26 fried eggs, a tray of bacon and a tray of pancakes. This is one of our foremen, and here was the other one. We were working for the signalling department, and a complete programme of re-signalling was being undertaken throughout the Rocky Mountain section. Semaphore signals were being replaced by colour light aspect signals. This entailed moving the signal posts and rewiring huge amounts of track. Apart from the number 1 passenger train and the number 2 passenger train, which went each way each day, there were a number of freight movements. The only way that we knew where these trains were was via radio. Obviously, as a train was due, we had to move vehicles on and off the track and keep the track clear. We were up early and had a huge breakfast, started work at 7 and probably finished about 5 o'clock, which was then followed by dinner. The evenings were our own, and after dinner you could either read or play games, or smoke pot, as a lot of them seemed to do. I hadn't smoked pot when I decided to climb this mast, but it was a very foolish thing to do. I struggled coming down. And don't be put off by their wild look. Most of the guys were about 5 years younger than Tony and I. Half of them seemed to be from the Rocky Mountain area, and the other half from the prairies. Neither of them could understand each other's way of life. Running around on these rail cars wasn't without risk. The foreman of each gang usually drove one of the cars. On these blind corners, you'd suddenly perhaps see a car coming the other way with another gang, and it was abandoned ship. We all had to get off, and the 2 rail cars on this occasion hit and went up in the air. Then it was bang, 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 trying to straighten out all the dents. These foremen were on a 3-strike or you were demoted policy, and most of them were on their last life. John was from Newfoundland, called Newfie by all. Frenchie climbed the poles, and we worked in great happiness on a shift programme. It meant we worked 9 days solid and then had 5 days off, covering the fortnight period. At the end of that fortnight, we had a free pass to take us either way on the train from wherever our gang train was into Vancouver, or if we wished, in the opposite direction to Jasper or Edmonton. Usually it was a passenger train, but on this occasion a freight, and it took us back to Vancouver. Our car came out of the garage, and off we went for a couple of days to Vancouver Island.
After our short vacation, it was back to work, and the number 2 passenger train out of Vancouver in the evening at 5 o'clock.
The dome car on the Super Continental was one of 6 Super Domes purchased by the Canadian National from the Milwaukee Road in 1964. These massive £224,000 cars had an 80-foot dome upper level, seating 68 passengers. Some are still in operation with heritage railways, such as this example restored to its original Milwaukee Road colours.
We would spend time in the observation car, we had an evening meal, and we were provided little couchettes, a bed that turned into a seat in its own little cabin. I eventually plucked up courage to ask drivers whether I could have a ride up front in the cab, and generally speaking they said yes. It had to be outside of Vancouver, but nevertheless it was quite a spectacular view. As the train trundled along at about 40 miles an hour and went round blind corners where there would be absolutely no chance of stopping if a boulder was on the line, a passenger train would leave from Vancouver and Toronto each day on a 3,000-odd mile journey taking 3 days. They would leave on time, but the arrival time was obviously entirely up to the journey and what happened on the way. There were 4 big diesel units up front on these passenger trains, which consisted of something like 23 coaches in total. Being a single-track railway across the country, trains had to pass each other at special sidings, and these meets were arranged by radio. Our gang train had moved to Blue River, and as luck would have it, some track laying was going on which we were able to watch. Huge lengths of rail were drawn off the flat trucks and welded together in continuous mile-long lengths. The track had to be heated with gas heaters before it was welded to allow for expansion, the difference between day and night temperatures. Our move to Blue River heralded the arrival of a track crane to enable us to lift and move signal posts. Up until this point, we had been digging trenches and laying cable, or stringing cable from telegraph poles. The crane looked a lot more fun. But there was a problem. The crane driver belonged to a different rail union, and his working time was 5 days on and 2 days off. The foreman in charge of the gang was a big Polish man named Stanley Tchaikovsky. What you saw was what you got with Stanley, and he didn't at all argue with the crane driver over these times, but just said to all of the gang that we now had to adopt these 5 days on and 2 days off rules. On the face of it, this wasn't a problem, but when one understood the length of journey that a number of us had to undertake to get from work back to home on these weekend breaks, it became obvious that in 2 days one couldn't travel very far. The crane driver and Stanley, as it happened, lived in Edmonton, and they could get home in a few hours. So for them it wasn't a problem. Other members of the gang who were going out onto the prairies into Saskatchewan, and indeed ourselves going to Vancouver, it would need a day and a half to get there and a day and a half to come back. Pretty soon people started taking sides. The crane driver was sent to Coventry, and the whole gang sunk into a malaise of unhappiness. We had a chat with this crane driver one evening and found out that the last thing he wanted was to cause trouble, but he didn't know what to do. We found out that he had no objections whatsoever in working 9 days on and having 5 days off. It was just that he didn't see how he could clear that with his union. We went to see Stanley and asked his permission to see if we could write a letter, perhaps to the engineering department we work for. He said we could. 5 days later, a senior management member of the signalling department got off the passing passenger train and came to talk to Stanley. We were called down to Stanley's caboose, where the senior member of management congratulated us. This is Don the cook, by the way. Every word he uttered began with F. But he was a lovely man and a good person to be friends with. The senior man from management had spoken to the crane drivers' union and cleared with them that it was all right for him to work the hours he wished at the right pay. The gang could go back to its old timings and everyone would be happy. The senior member of management called us to him before he left and said he was very impressed as to how 2 boys from the old country had managed to sort out this with integrity. So he gave Tony the job of looking after all the stores and tools that were used by the gang every day and taking them back in at night and keeping a track of everything. He made me the crane driver's mate. Wonderful. It was quite a privilege to put your hand up and wave down a 20-odd coach passenger train. But there we were, set for Vancouver again. None of the other boys seemed put out in the slightest about our elevation to these new jobs, and indeed they were very happy to have got back onto this old schedule. Stanley got credit for using his initiative with these Brits, and Tony and I were offered university places in Edmonton when we finished our apprenticeship. We had a great future with Canadian National. It was a great shame that with our savings and earnings, we'd already purchased 2 boat tickets for the P&O ship Oriana, leaving Vancouver the beginning of November. We had decided to set a date on our return back to England and plan a journey around the States. We got extra food and tea from Don in the cook car if we stayed behind after dinner. We all had what turned out to be a very lucky escape. Our water wagon was replenished every week or so, and a new one brought along by the daily goods train, which supplied equipment and stores to all the gangs. This wagon had the look of an old oil tanker and held perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 gallons of water, so it must have weighed 20-30 tons. There was a brake situated halfway up the front of this wagon with a screw-down handle, and the crew of the train decided to perform what they called a flying switch. The locomotive pulling the water wagon started forward and gained some momentum. They then uncoupled the locomotive and it accelerated away over a set of points leading to our train. The set of points, or switch, was then thrown till the wagon was diverted down towards our train. The brakeman sat on the front, screwing down the brake to bring the wagon to a gradual halt. But it didn't happen that way. The brake failed to operate, the brakeman jumped off, and the wagon crashed into the end restaurant car, where in 5 minutes' time we should have been sat having our lunch. As it was, we were knocked off our feet in our own car. Don, the chef, and his helper were submerged in pots and pans and food, but amazingly were unscathed. But the restaurant car was destroyed, half of it completely crushed into matchsticks of wood. One can only guess at what would have happened if we'd all been sat down there having our lunch. This is a typical meet where one train would go into a siding to allow another one to pass. And we continued our journey on down towards Kamloops and Vancouver. It was sad to end our railway careers and planning our next adventure
One thing that might interest people is your camera. Can you just tell me a tiny bit about the camera and the problems that you had, or anyone would have, in operating an old type 8mm cine camera?
Well, of course, it's clockwork. I mean, you wind it up and you have to keep winding it up. And it carries film, a 25-foot length of film, which in fact you have to turn over halfway through. It makes 50 foot when it goes to the processor and it's split and joined together. But changing the film over, you have to make sure no light gets in the camera. And depending where you're filming, this can be very difficult. And of course, with these films, you have to send them away for processing. In this case, it had to come back to Kodak at Hemel Hempstead before you got the finished film back home, hopefully. I never lost one.